Welcome to The Critique. Today we're reviewing a comprehensive portfolio containing the draft transcript of the 2026 State of the Union Address, alongside international news and Israeli commentary regarding its geopolitical implications.
Let's dive right in. Applying the foreign policy lens, there is a distinct narrative tension between the speech's triumphalist rhetoric and the complex strategic reality outlined in the commentary.
Right, so looking at this, and it's a massive package, by the way, there's a real balance they're trying to strike between projecting absolute strength and justifying a massive military budget.
Yeah, exactly. The core weakness in this first section is the severe friction between claiming a total, finalized victory and describing an ongoing, fragile reality.
I noticed that immediately when reading the notes on the Israeli Channel 14 analysis.
Right. So if we look at the actual text of the speech, it references Operation Midnight Hammer. That's the strike on the nuclear facilities. In these highly absolute terms.
Very absolute.
It uses phrases like, obliterated Iran's nuclear weapons program, or we wiped it out. It presents the neutralization of the threat as a completed historical event, a total mission accomplished moment from last June.
Yeah, it reads completely like a victory lap. Like, we did it, everybody go home, it's over.
Correct. But then, and this is where the disconnect happens, when we cross-reference this with the submitted commentary from the Israeli experts, we see a totally different picture.
A much more anxious picture.
Highly anxious. They describe the current situation not as a finished war, but as a careful war of words. They explicitly note that Iran is actively rebuilding, they're negotiating, looking for loopholes.
So that creates a distinct disconnect for the listener, because the material makes a really strong case for peace through strength, but if the enemy is already obliterated,
then the logic for a $1 trillion budget request falls apart.
Right. It begs the question, if we wipe them out, why are we still on high alert?
Exactly. Why do we need the money?
Precisely. The Israeli analysts point out that the threat is entirely persistent. They mention the missiles that can threaten Europe, the ones in development that can reach the U.S., and to be fair, the speech actually admits this a few sentences later. It says they want to start all over again.
But because the opening salvo is so definitive we wiped it out, it just creates this confusing narrative arc.
It really does. It undermines the administration's credibility with an informed audience who knows that we are still in a very high-stakes standoff. So we want the victory lap because obviously the president needs to take credit for the strike, but you also absolutely need the warning to justify the policy moving forward. What's the suggestion for refining this arc?
The suggestion is to refine the narrative to acknowledge the persistence of the threat as the primary justification for continued strength rather than claiming the problem is solved while simultaneously asking for vigilance.
Okay, I like that.
We need to shift the frame from total victory to active dominance.
Active dominance. That is a really vital shift. Can you give a concrete example from the current text of how to actually execute that edit?
For sure. Let's look closely at the section discussing Midnight Hammer. Currently, the text says, we wiped it out and they want to start all over again, and then it immediately pivots to claims of having the most powerful military on Earth.
Right.
The actionable edit here is to utilize a detail that is already in the text, but is currently buried, the secret words.
Oh, right. I remember seeing that. The text says we haven't heard those secret words, referring to the diplomatic promise to never build a weapon.
Yes. It's a really powerful, mysterious little phrase. So instead of pivoting directly to the slogan about peace through strength, the writers should weave in that Israeli analyst's perspective about the war of words.
How so?
Frame the narrative not just as a past victory, but as an active standoff, where the American military presence is the only thing enforcing the silence.
So how does that actually sound in practice?
Structure the argument more like this. We obliterated the program last June, but silence is not the same as safety. We haven't heard the secret words because they're waiting for us to blink. We need this budget to ensure that their silence remains permanent.
That is so much stronger.
It bridges the gap.
It completely bridges it. It moves from the mission accomplished feel of the strike to the current danger of the missiles, and it validates the geopolitical reality.
Right. It respects the intelligence in the portfolio while keeping the political win front and center. It turns the budget from a luxury into an absolute necessity.
Okay, that's incredibly actionable. Moving on, let's look at the emotional flow of the draft. This brings us to the structure and flow lens, because as I was reading through the raw transcript, I felt a good deal of turbulence.
Turbulence is a very polite way to put it. This is a critical area for improvement. The structural arrangement of emotional beats creates a severe tonal whiplash that undercuts the gravity of the tragic elements.
Tonal whiplash. Yeah, it feels like we are violently bouncing between visceral horror and sports jubilation.
It is a jarring experience. The weakness is that the material moves from deeply graphic, solemn descriptions to lighthearted economic or sports celebration without giving the audience any time to process.
The most egregious example of this has to be the transition around the hostage recovery.
Absolutely. That section about the 28 hostages is incredibly heavy reading.
It talks about the gruesome recovery, explicitly mentioning living and dead. It describes the cooperation between Hamas and Israel to, quote, dig through bodies to find them.
It paints this horrific picture of parents grieving a dead son. It is a very somber moment intended to honor profound sacrifice. But immediately after this, literally almost in the next breath, the text pivots to the Olympic hockey team and the phrase, "We're winning so much."
It's startling. You're visualizing digging up bodies in the Middle East, and then suddenly you're eating popcorn at a hockey game. The gravity of the hostage recovery is entirely undercut.
Exactly. It risks making the celebratory elements feel dismissive of the tragedy that just preceded them. You cannot ask an audience to weep and then stand up and cheer within a span of 30 seconds. The human brain just doesn't reset that fast.
No, it doesn't. And I don't think the connection between the winning in the economy and the winning of bringing back dead bodies is fully established anyway. It feels like two totally different speeches got spliced together.
It does.
So how do we fix this without cutting the content? Because the writers clearly want to highlight both the somber victories, bringing people home, and the joyous ones, the sports and the economy.
The suggestion is to group thematic elements into distinct emotional blocks. Solemnity and sacrifice in one block versus prosperity and pride in another. Do not intersperse them.
Grouping them creates a narrative journey rather than a roller coaster.
Yes, it respects the weight of the tragic elements and makes the celebratory elements actually feel earned.
Let's get concrete with this. How would you reorder these specific sections in the draft?
The actionable edit is to completely move the Olympic hockey and the World Cup segments. Currently, they sit right next to the hostage recovery. Move those sports segments to the Golden Age economic section, much earlier in the speech.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. That Golden Age section is already full of high energy, stock market records, job numbers.
Exactly. It's a cohesive upbeat. The hockey team fits perfectly there.
And then what about the heavy material?
You create a dedicated sacrifice and security block later in the speech. Keep the hostage recovery story paired with the angel moms, like Jacqueline Medina, whose daughter was killed, and the tributes to the military heroes, like the pilots Eric Slover and Royce Williams.
Got it. So you group the dig imagery regarding the hostages with the story of the pilot who survived 263 bullet holes?
Yes. By grouping the visceral war stories and the victims of crime together, you allow the president to adopt a somber, reverent tone for a sustained period. It allows the audience to actually sit with the grief and the heroism.
You know, it also changes the sound of the room. The transcript has all these bracketed notes for applause and heat.
That is a crucial observation. The applause for a pilot who survived the dogfight should sound fundamentally different from the applause for a hockey team winning gold.
Right. One is reverent, the other is raucous.
And by grouping the sections, you allow the live audience to modulate their reaction appropriately. Currently, the script demands a switch back and forth too rapidly, which is just going to result in confused, tepid reactions to both.
That is a very clear structural improvement. Emotional coherence is key for a speech.
Definitely.
All right, let's shift gears to our third and final critique. This one focuses on the audience alignment lens, specifically looking at the domestic policy argument.
The reliance on extremely specific, localized anecdotes to drive broad national policy creates a major risk of alienation.
Specificity is usually a good thing in speech writing.
Specific is good, but niche is bad. The weakness here is that the speech aims to address the entire union, but it frequently zooms in so tight that the listener might feel like they are hearing about a local grievance rather than a national crisis or a national vision.
You're referring to the war on fraud sector, right?
That is the prime example. The text explicitly singles out the Somali community in Minnesota and refers to Somali pirates ransacking the state.
Right.
Now, putting aside the political nature of the statement, strictly from a speechwriting perspective, this is hyper-specific. It risks sounding like a regional issue. If I'm listening in Arizona or Florida, I might think, well,
That sounds like a Minnesota problem.
I assume the same logic applies to the Trump accounts section later in the draft.
Yes. The speech references specific wealthy donors, Michael and Susan Dell, and Brad Gertzner, and it goes into this long tangent about Michael Dell selling computers in his dorm room back in the day.
It's a classic American success story, but does it actually serve the core argument?
Exactly. The listener is tuning in to hear how their own life will improve, not how Michael Dell made his fortune in the 1980s. The writers want to give credit to the donors, which is fine, but it distracts entirely from the what's in it for me factor for the average American.
It becomes about the benefactor, not the beneficiary.
Right. So what's the suggestion? Elevate the specific anecdotes so they serve as clearly defined symbols for the entire audience, rather than remaining isolated incidents.
Okay, let's break that down into concrete examples. How do we fix the Minnesota fraud section so it doesn't sound like a local complaint?
The actionable edit is to broaden the narrative immediately. The text currently mentions California and Massachusetts in passing, but completely glosses over them to focus on Minnesota.
So bring them to the forefront.
Yes. Keep the Minnesota example if you must, as it illustrates the mechanism of the fraud, but link it immediately and forcefully to California and Massachusetts to show a nationwide pattern.
So the line should read something like, from the fraud rings in Minnesota to the exploitation in California, this is a 50-state crisis.
Exactly. That moves it from a local grievance to a national mandate for the proposed task force. Ensure the villain in the anecdote is a systemic issue, like systemic fraud, not just a specific demographic group, to maintain that presidential stature.
That makes the war on fraud feel like a federal issue worthy of a State of the Union. And what about the Trump accounts and the Michael Dell story?
For the accounts, we need to refine the pitch entirely. Cut the backstory about the dorm room. The listener needs to hear about the impact. The focus should be on the figure mentioned in the text, the $100,000.
Right. The text notes that with modest contributions, these accounts could grow to over $100,000 for the child.
That is the headline. The actionable edit is to strip out the selling computers anecdote and replace it with a visualization of what that $100,000 means for the kid.
Like, this isn't just an account. This is a down payment on a home.
Yes. A college education, a business startup. The donor's name can be mentioned in brief gratitude, but the narrative weight must remain on the recipient, the American child. That is how you align with the audience. You make the policy about them.
That is a crucial distinction. It shifts the focus to who the voter actually identifies with.
And if you want a benchmark for how to do this right, look at the anecdote they included about the IVF medication, the story about Catherine Renner.
Oh yes, where her medication cost from $4,000 to $500.
That anecdote works perfectly. It is the gold standard in this draft. Why? Because the savings, $4,000 down to $500, is a concrete, universal benefit. The listener instantly understands the value proposition.
So the goal is to make the Minnesota fraud story and the Dell story hit with the same universal clarity as the IVF story.
Absolutely. Harmonize them so they all point directly to a concrete benefit or protection for the American people at large.
There is one more piece to this audience alignment lens, which is the Angel Moms section.
Yes, Elizabeth Medina's mother, Jacqueline. This is a very strong, visceral section, but again, we must ensure it aligns with the national audience.
The text mentions she was killed by a previously arrested illegal alien, which connects directly to the Delilah law proposed earlier in the speech.
And that connection is excellent. It links a specific tragedy to a specific legislative fix. The writers need to replicate this exact structure for the other anecdotes we just discussed.
So the formula they should follow is anecdote, leading to systemic failure, leading to legislative solution.
Correct. In the War on Fraud section, we currently have the anecdote, which is Minnesota, the systemic failure, which is the bribery, but the legislative solution is just a vague task force.
Strengthening that link to a specific outcome, like a federal anti-fraud act, would align it much better.
It really would. It prevents the speech from becoming just a list of grievances or a list of brags and turns it into a coherent argument for governance.
That is a fantastic, actionable template for them to follow. Anecdote, systemic failure, legislative solution. It keeps the speech moving with purpose.
I agree. The raw material is absolutely there. The anecdotes are powerful, the policy wins are clear, and the geopolitical stakes are obviously very high. It is strictly a matter of arrangement and framing at this point.
We've covered a lot of ground today. Let's recap the main action items for the writing team.
First, on the foreign policy front, align the mission accomplished rhetoric with the reality of the ongoing threat. Don't just say we wiped it out. Use the secret words detailed to frame the situation as an active standoff that requires funding to maintain. Shift from total victory to active dominance.
Second, regarding structure and flow, reorder the speech blocks to separate visceral tragedy from celebratory sports moments. Move the hockey and World Cup segments to the Golden Age economic block. Keep the hostage recovery and military tributes together in a dedicated sacrifice block to avoid emotional whiplash.
And third, on audience alignment, elevate the specific domestic anecdote. Broaden the war on fraud narrative to link Minnesota to a national pattern. And refine the Trump account story to focus entirely on the $100,000 impact for the child rather than the donor's biography.
Thank you to the listener for submitting this massive, fascinating portfolio. It is a highly complex piece of political communication, and we'd love to see how you implement these structural changes. Please submit the revised draft for a follow-up critique. We'd be eager to see how the narrative arc tightens up.
Definitely. Good luck with the revisions. There's a great speech in here.
Until next time, keep refining your work. This has been The Critique.